So picture this. How do you bring a brand new religion into a land that's already, well, crowded with ancient, powerful spirits? Do you try to fight them? Erase their memory? Well, Tibetan Buddhism came up with a much, much more interesting solution. It gave them a job. Okay, let's dive into this incredible system of cosmic recruitment.
I mean, really think about that question for a second. What if new beliefs didn't just bulldoze the old gods, but instead put out a help wanted sign? This is the core, kind of radical idea we're going to unpack. It's a story of transformation, not conquest.
All right, first things first, let's get our terms straight. When we talk about a deity in Tibet, you got to throw out the idea of a single, all-powerful creator god. It's not that at all. Instead, think of it like a huge spectrum of beings, all the way from fully enlightened Buddhas down to these really potent local nature spirits that might live in just one mountain or one river. The real difference isn't God versus not a god. It's about who's enlightened and who's still working on it.
To really get this, we have to travel back in time, to a Tibet where the landscape itself was just humming with invisible forces. It was literally alive. You see, before Buddhism even showed up on the scene, Tibet was a world run by countless local spirits. You had mountain gods, the Yulha, who basically owned the territory. You had water spirits or nagas in the lakes, and you had these powerful earth lords called Sadak. And listen, this wasn't just cute folklore. This was the spiritual and political reality of the day. And for a new religion like Buddhism, that was a huge problem to solve. Now, this massive shift didn't happen overnight, but it definitely had a tipping point. Before the 7th century, Tibet is this animistic, shamanic world. But then, in the 8th century, the Buddhist master Padmasambhava shows up and everything changes. He introduces this whole new system, which then gets formalized and baked into the monasteries over the next few hundred years. And that brings us right to the heart of the conflict, and the absolutely brilliant, innovative solution that came out of it. The strategy was simple, but profound. Subdue, don't destroy. So you get the problem, right? These powerful local spirits, they weren't exactly laying out the welcome mat for these new Buddhist ideas. They fought back. The solution comes from this legendary tantric master from India, Padmasambhava, and his idea was, well, pretty out there. His strategy was just revolutionary. Instead of getting into this endless war, trying to wipe out all these hostile forces, he decided he would recruit them. He would turn these existential threats into his most powerful, sworn allies. This single conceptual leap is what gives Tibetan Buddhism its totally unique character. Okay, so how in the world do you actually tame a wild, ancient mountain god? It wasn't just random. There was a clear process, almost like a mythical instruction manual. We can call it the subjugation cycle. The process almost always follows this clear 5-step pattern. First, you have the encounter, where a great Buddhist master confronts a powerful and usually pretty angry local spirit. Second, the subjugation. The master uses their deep tantric power to basically win the fight. But then comes the most important part, step 3, the oath-taking. The defeated spirit is bound by a sacred vow, a damshig, to protect the Buddhist teachings forever. Then it's institutionalization. The spirit gets a new job, a new shrine, new rituals. And finally, over time, you see elevation, where they might even get promoted to become a formal guardian of an entire monastery. And this wasn't a one-and-done deal, you know? This process created an ongoing relationship, one that had to be constantly managed through a really sophisticated system of ritual. Think of it like a new cosmic org chart. At the very top, Tier 1, you've got the fully enlightened beings, the Buddhas. They're like the C-suite, totally outside the karmic rat race. Way down at the bottom, Tier 3, are the wild cards, unbound spirits that are still unpredictable and potentially dangerous. And right there in the middle, at Tier 2, are our newly hired protectors. They're the powerful middle managers of the cosmos, formerly wild, but now under contract to protect the whole enterprise. Honestly, a great way to wrap your head around this is to think of it like a user interface for a complex, invisible world. All the rituals, the offerings, the chants, they're basically the command language, the protocols you use to interact with all these different layers of reality. And this interface had 2 main operating modes. You had your peaceful rituals, which are all about stability and harmony. You'd use offerings like water and flowers. But then you also had wrathful rituals, designed to get rid of obstacles and fast. These were intense, commanding, and used symbolic offerings like flesh and blood to engage these fiercer energies. But it's not good versus evil. It's just about using the right tool for the right job. Okay, so let's make this a little less abstract. It's time to actually meet some of these guardians and see how this whole system played out in the real world, from a local wild spirit all the way up to a powerful state oracle. So you basically got two main types. You have your enlightened protectors, like Mahakala. Now, he wasn't some converted spirit. He's seen as a direct manifestation of a Buddha, like a form of wrathful compassion. He's 100% reliable. But then you have your worldly protectors, like Pehar. He was a powerful local spirit that Padmasambhava subdued, and while he's incredibly powerful, he's still caught in the cycle of karma, so he has to be managed a bit more carefully. And I want to be really clear, this was not just theology. This system of managing protector deities had a direct, powerful influence on Tibetan government and politics for centuries. Let's go back to that worldly protector, Pehar. Get this, he is believed to speak through the single most important oracle in all of Tibet, the Nichung Oracle. For hundreds of years, this oracle has advised the Dalai Lama on the most critical matters of state, everything from major policy decisions to identifying the reincarnations of high lamas. It is a direct fusion of mysticism and government. So let's just zoom out for a second and look at the huge idea that this whole system is really built on. It's a cosmos that's defined, more than anything, by conversion. This is the key takeaway. Tibetan Buddhism didn't just show up and pave over the earlier beliefs. No, it absorbed them. It restructured them. It gave them a new job description within a much larger Buddhist framework. The whole philosophy can be summed up like this. Dangerous spirits became oath-bound protectors. Local guards became guardians of Buddhist territory. Transformation, not elimination. That was the governing principle. You could almost call it a model of cosmic diplomacy. And this really visualizes the strategy perfectly. The Tibetan model didn't waste energy destroying or ignoring what was already there. The main method, by a huge margin, was integration. It was a sophisticated act of cultural and spiritual synthesis. So why does all this matter? Well, because this adaptive, integrative approach created this incredibly layered, powerful, and unbelievably resilient spiritual worldview. It let Tibetan culture hold on to its deep, ancient connection to the landscape while adopting a universal religion. It's a system that honors the past by reframing it for the future, and it's still going strong today. Which really just leaves us with one final thought to chew on. What can this ancient model, this blueprint for turning adversaries into allies, for integrating the old with the new, teach us about how cultures, and maybe even how we ourselves, can adapt, evolve, and find a place for all the powerful forces that shape our world?